Welcome to Galactic University, where the lecture halls are chrome-plated, the cafeteria serves 17 different types of methane soup, and the parking situation is somehow worse than Earth colleges despite having 3 dimensions to work with. Today we're visiting Xenobiology 101, a class specifically designed to study what the academic community politely calls emerging sapient species, and what everyone else calls those weird little creatures that might be smart someday. Professor Crix strutted into the lecture hall like he owned the place, which technically he did since his family had donated the West Wing after making a fortune in asteroid mining. Standing 8 feet tall, with skin that looked like someone had upholstered a basketball in purple leather, Crix was what you'd get if you crossed a really arrogant peacock with a particularly judgmental giraffe. His species, the Vorthak, had been running the galaxy's educational system for about 3,000 years, mostly because they were the only ones boring enough to sit through faculty meetings. "Students," Crix announced in his perpetually condescending tone, adjusting his tiny spectacles that served no purpose since Vorthak had perfect vision, "today we begin our study of primitive species and their amusing attempts at civilization." The class was your typical mix of galactic youth. There was Blix, a crystalline Zolonian who communicated through color changes and was currently flickering a smug shade of orange. Next to him sat Morp, a blob-like Fluidian who had somehow managed to look down on other species despite not having eyes. In the back row, a cluster of insectoid Chitaks were clicking their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind. They all shared one thing in common, the absolute certainty that they were the pinnacle of evolution, and everything else was just waiting to catch up. "Now," Professor Crix continued, "before we begin, I'd like you all to meet my teaching assistant." He gestured grandly toward the side door. "Class, say hello to Fluffy." What walked through that door was definitely not Fluffy. Picture a scorpion that had been hitting the gym for about 10 years straight. Add some extra legs, throw in enough armor plating to stop a tank shell, and give it the kind of claws that could open cans or jugulars with equal ease. Fluffy was 12 feet of pure, concentrated murder wrapped in chitin and bad intention. His species, the Deathstalkers, were literally named by their first victims, which should tell you everything you need to know about their disposition. Fluffy padded over to Professor Crix and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a garbage disposal eating silverware. The professor reached up and scratched behind what might charitably be called ears, if ears were made of bone spikes and nightmare fuel. "Good boy," Crix cooed, then turned back to his students. "Fluffy here represents the apex of predator evolution. 12 hearts, regenerating limbs, venom that can dissolve steel, and reflexes fast enough to catch laser bolts. The perfect killing machine, shaped by millions of years of natural selection." The students murmured appreciatively. Even by galactic standards, keeping a Deathstalker as a pet was impressively stupid, or impressively brave, and with Professor Crix it was usually hard to tell the difference. "Which brings us," the professor said, pulling up a holographic display, "to today's subject, humans. A recently discovered species from a little backwater planet called Earth. They've managed to achieve rudimentary space travel, which would be impressive if it hadn't taken them so embarrassingly long to figure out." The display showed images of humans doing human things, walking, talking, building cities, and generally looking far less impressive than any species that had managed to join the galactic community. "Now, through our generous exchange program," Crix continued with the tone of someone describing charity work, "we've managed to acquire a live specimen for observation. Students, please welcome our very own human, Jake Murphy." And that's when Jake walked in. Jake Murphy looked exactly like what you'd expect from a human exchange student. Slightly confused, carrying too many books, and wearing what appeared to be a t-shirt with something called a drop bear on it. He had that particular expression that humans get when they're trying to be polite in a situation they don't quite understand, which is basically their default setting in most social interactions. "G'day, everyone," Jake said with a cheerful wave, completely oblivious to the fact that he was being studied like a particularly interesting lab rat. "Sorry I'm late. Had a bit of trouble with the gravity lift. These things are way different from elevators back home." Professor Crix smiled the way a shark might smile if sharks had taken several courses in customer service. "Ah yes, our human specimen. Please, take a seat anywhere you'd like." Jake looked around the lecture hall, noted that most of the seats had suddenly become vacant in his general vicinity, and shrugged. "No worries, I'll just sit up front. Better view of the action, yeah?" "Excellent," Creek said, his smile growing wider and significantly more predatory, "because today, Jake, you're going to help us demonstrate the fundamental differences between a true apex predator and, well, your species." He gestured to Fluffy, who was currently using one of his massive claws to clean what might have been teeth from between his other claws. You see, class, humans represent an interesting evolutionary dead end. They've achieved a certain level of intelligence, yes, but they lack the physical attributes necessary for true dominance. No claws, no natural armor, no venom, laughably slow reflexes. They're essentially very clever prey animals who've managed to convince themselves they're predators. The class was eating this up. Blix was flickering a delighted shade of yellow. Morph had formed what looked suspiciously like a smug expression despite being a blob, and the Chitaks were clicking their approval so loudly it sounded like a percussion section having a seizure. Now, Professor Crakes continued, observe how Fluffy reacts to the presence of our human friend. Notice how his predator instincts immediately classify Jake as potential prey. This was the moment when everything went spectacularly wrong. Fluffy, who had been lounging near the professor's desk like a 12-foot armored house cat, suddenly caught Jake's scent. His massive head snapped up, all 6 eyes focused with laser precision on the human student. For a moment everyone held their breath, waiting to see the apex predator's reaction to meeting a member of humanity. Fluffy took one look at Jake, made a sound that could only be described as a whimper, and immediately scrambled behind Professor Crix's desk with all the grace of a freight train trying to hide behind a lamppost. The silence that followed was the kind of silence you get when the universe decides to completely ignore your carefully laid plans and go with something much more entertaining. Fluffy? Professor Crix called, his voice cracking slightly. Fluffy, what are you doing back there? More whimpering sounds emerged from behind the desk, along with what sounded suspiciously like 12 hearts, all beating way too fast. Jake, meanwhile, was looking genuinely concerned. Oh no, did I scare him? I'm really sorry, I know some animals can be sensitive to new smells. Back home, my neighbor's dog used to hide under the bed whenever I came back from camping. He reached into his bag and pulled out what looked like a small rectangular device. Hey, maybe this will help him relax. I've got some photos of my pets back home. Animals usually like seeing other animals, right? Now, if you've never seen an entire classroom of supposedly superior alien species have a collective mental breakdown, you're missing out on one of the universe's greatest spectacles. It starts slowly, like a dam developing a crack, and then everything goes to hell in a handbasket made of pure, concentrated terror. Jake held up his holophone with the enthusiasm of a proud pet parent at a barbecue. This is my buddy Steve, he said, swiping to the first photo. He's a huntsman spider, really friendly little guy, only about the size of a dinner plate. The holographic image materialized above the device in perfect, 3-dimensional detail. Steve the huntsman spider appeared in all his 8-legged glory, roughly the size of a small pizza and covered in enough hair to upholster a chair. His 8 eyes glittered with the kind of alien intelligence that suggested he was plotting something, probably involving whoever was looking at his photo. Blix immediately turned a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, and made a sound like breaking glass. 3 of the Chitaks fainted on the spot, which was impressive since their species didn't technically have the neurological capacity for fainting. Morp, the blob-like fluidian, somehow managed to turn himself inside out, which was biologically fascinating and psychologically traumatic for everyone involved. Oh, don't worry, Jake said, noticing the reaction but completely misinterpreting it. Steve's totally harmless. He just eats the dangerous stuff around the house. You know, the redback spiders, funnel webs, that sort of thing. Professor Crix was making small choking sounds, but Jake was already swiping to the next photo with the enthusiasm of someone who clearly hadn't read the room. And this beautiful girl is Sheila, he continued proudly. The hologram shifted to show what Jake apparently considered a beautiful girl, but what everyone else recognized as approximately 10 feet of scaled death with fangs that could puncture steel plating. She's an inland taipan, sweetest snake you'll ever meet, though you've got to be careful with the handling. One bite has enough venom to kill about 100 adult humans, but she's really shy, so she hardly ever bites anyone. At this point, even the furniture was trying to leave. 2 desks had actually started moving toward the exits, and someone had activated the emergency ventilation system, though whether it was intentional or just the building's survival instincts kicking in was unclear. Jake, oblivious to the mass exodus beginning around him, swiped to the next photo. Oh, and here's my little Oscar. He's a blue-ringed octopus, only about this big, he held up his thumb and forefinger, but packed with enough venom to kill 26 adult humans in minutes. The blue rings light up when he's excited. Isn't that adorable? The hologram showed what looked like a tiny, innocent sea creature decorated with beautiful blue rings that pulsed with an almost hypnotic pattern. It would have been quite pretty if everyone in the room hadn't just learned it was basically a tiny, tentacled missile of death. Of course, you can't actually keep them as pets. Jake added conversationally. "But Oscar lives in the tide pool near my house, so I visit him sometimes. He seems to remember me." From behind the desk, Fluffy made a sound that suggested he was seriously reconsidering his life choices. Professor Crix, meanwhile, had gone a fascinating shade of green that probably indicated either extreme nausea or the Vorthak equivalent of a panic attack. But Jake wasn't done. "Oh, and I almost forgot the drop bears," he said, swiping again. At this point, you have to understand that Jake Murphy was operating under the fundamental human delusion that he was being helpful. In his mind, he was simply sharing some nice photos to calm down what he assumed was a nervous pet. He had absolutely no idea that he was systematically deconstructing 3,000 years of galactic civilization's understanding of predator-prey relationships. "Actually," Jake said, looking up from his phone with the kind of expression humans get when they're about to be really, really helpful, "since this is a xenobiology class, maybe I can help explain why humans might seem a bit different from what you'd expect." Professor Crix made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and the noise a garbage disposal makes when you accidentally drop a spoon in it. He was currently pressed against the whiteboard like he was trying to phase through it into another dimension, preferably one without humans. "See, the thing is," Jake continued in his cheerfully educational tone, "humans aren't really built like most predators. We're actually pretty fragile, like embarrassingly fragile. We're so weak that we actually have to eat poison for fun." He said this like it was perfectly normal, which of course it was, to humans. "Take chili peppers, for instance," Jake went on, apparently warming to his subject. "They literally evolved capsaicin specifically to stop mammals from eating them. It's a chemical weapon designed to cause pain and suffering, and we thought, yeah, that sounds delicious, and built entire cuisines around it. Some of us even have competitions to see who can eat the most concentrated versions." Morp, who had somehow managed to turn himself right side out again, immediately inverted back into his panic configuration. "Or alcohol," Jake added helpfully. "It's literally poison. Our livers have to work overtime to process it because our bodies recognize it as a toxin. But we don't just drink it, we celebrate with it. We have special occasions specifically dedicated to consuming liver toxins in social settings." From behind the desk came a sound that suggested Fluffy was having some kind of existential crisis about the nature of predator and prey. "And that's just the food," Jake continued, clearly on a roll now. "Humans are so naturally cowardly that we had to invent ways to scare ourselves for entertainment. We create fictional monsters and then pay money to watch them hunt people in dark rooms. We call them horror movies, and some of us watch them while eating poison peppers and drinking liver toxin." The few students who hadn't fled yet were staring at Jake with the kind of expression you'd reserve for watching someone juggle active grenades while riding a unicycle over a pit of lava. "Oh, in extreme sports," Jake said, his face lighting up with enthusiasm. "Since our planet wasn't naturally dangerous enough, we invented new ways to almost die for fun. We jump off perfectly good cliffs with only a bit of fabric to slow us down. We strap ourselves to boards and throw ourselves down mountains covered in frozen water at ridiculous speeds. Some people tie elastic ropes to their ankles and jump off bridges just to see how close they can get to the ground without actually hitting it." Professor Crix was now making small mewling sounds and appeared to be trying to burrow through the wall using only his fingernails. "But here's the really weird part," Jake said, completely oblivious to the psychological carnage he was wreaking. "We're so naturally defenseless that we had to make friends with predators just to survive. So we took wolves, pack hunters, with inch-long fangs designed for tearing throats out, and we said, hey, want to live in our houses and sleep in our beds? And now we have dogs. Some people have pet tigers. Tigers. We literally domesticated apex predators and turned them into cuddle buddies." At this point, Fluffy had somehow managed to squeeze his 12-foot armored bulk completely under Professor Crix's desk, and was making sounds that suggested he was seriously reconsidering his entire evolutionary strategy. "Of course, that's nothing compared to cats," Jake added conversationally. "We invited tiny predators into our homes, gave them food and shelter, and they repay us by bringing us dead things as presents and knocking our stuff off tables. And we think it's adorable. Some humans have dozens of them." The sound from under the desk now resembled a very large, very dangerous creature having a complete nervous breakdown while trying to dig a hole to hide in. Professor Crix had reached that special stage of academic panic where his carefully constructed worldview was crumbling faster than a cookie in a hydraulic press. His purple skin had taken on a distinctly greenish tint, and his tiny, useless spectacles were fogged up with what could only be described as the condensation of pure existential dread. Wait. he managed to stammer, his voice climbing several octaves into ranges that probably violated noise ordinances. Your Deathstalker is… My Fluffy is malfunctioning. This doesn't make sense. He's a perfect killing machine, apex predator. Millions of years of evolution designed specifically for murder and mayhem. He should be classifying you as prey, not… He gestured helplessly at the desk, from under which came the sounds of what appeared to be hyperventilation, if hyperventilation could involve 12 hearts and sound like a freight train having an anxiety attack. Jake looked genuinely concerned and crouched down next to the desk. Hey there, big fella, you okay under there? The whimpering intensified. Oh, I think I know what's wrong, Jake said, straightening up with the expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly tricky puzzle. He's not broken, Professor. He's just smart. Smart? Professor Crete's voice cracked like a 13-year-old going through puberty. What do you mean, smart? Well, Jake said, settling into his explanation with the patience of someone who'd clearly had to explain obvious things to confused people before. Fluffy here is doing exactly what any intelligent predator should do when it encounters something higher up the food chain. The classroom had gone so quiet you could hear individual dust particles settling. Even the emergency ventilation system seemed to be holding its breath. You see, Jake continued, predators recognize other predators, and Fluffy's figured out something that your textbooks apparently missed. Humans didn't climb to the top of the food chain by being the biggest, strongest, or fastest. We got there by being absolutely, completely, utterly insane. He said this with the casual tone you'd use to discuss the weather, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. Think about it from his perspective, Jake went on, warming to his theme. Here's a species that's so naturally weak and defenseless that everything on their planet evolved specifically to kill them. Venomous spiders, poisonous snakes, man-eating sharks, disease-carrying insects, plants that can blind you, weather that can freeze or boil you to death, everything. And instead of finding a nice, safe planet to live on, humans looked around and said, you know what this place needs? More danger. From under the desk came a sound that might have been sobbing, if apex predators were capable of sobbing. So they invented new ways to almost die, Jake continued. Then they created something called boxing, where two people try to knock each other unconscious for entertainment. They invented motor racing, where people drive metal boxes at hundreds of miles per hour just to see who can go fastest without dying. They have something called free solo rock climbing, where people climb 1,000-foot cliff faces without any safety equipment whatsoever, just because the possibility of falling to their death makes it more authentic. Professor Crix was making small choking noises and appeared to be using the whiteboard to hold himself upright. But here's the really scary part, Jake said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a particularly good ghost story. Humans got so good at not dying that they got bored, so they started looking for new challenges. They went to the deepest parts of their oceans, where the pressure would crush any normal creature instantly, just to see what was down there. They climbed the highest mountains, where there's barely enough oxygen to breathe, because they were there. They even strapped themselves to controlled explosions and shot themselves off their planet just to see what was on other worlds. At this point, several things happened simultaneously. The remaining Chittak made a collective decision to abandon ship and scrambled toward the exits in a clicking, chittering wave of panic. Blix had turned a color that didn't have a name and was rapidly cycling through what appeared to be his species' entire emotional spectrum, and Morph had somehow managed to flatten himself against the back wall like a terrified pancake. And now, Jake said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reassuring whisper, but came across as the kind of tone serial killers use in horror movies. Humans have figured out space travel. They're out here, exploring the galaxy, meeting new species, making friends. He paused for effect. Looking for new challenges. The sound from under the desk suggested that Fluffy had just realized the full implications of sharing a galaxy with a species that considered almost dying a recreational activity. So no, Professor, Jake concluded cheerfully. Fluffy's not malfunctioning. He's just smart enough to recognize that when you've spent millions of years evolving to be a perfect killing machine, the last thing you want to meet is something that's spent millions of years evolving to be unkillable. And then decided that wasn't exciting enough. Professor Crick stood there for a long moment, his entire worldview crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane made of existential dread. His carefully prepared lecture notes on human limitations and primitive behaviors suddenly seemed less like academic material and more like a survival guide he should have read more carefully. He looked at Jake, then at his cowering apex predator, then back at Jake, and you could practically hear the sound of 3,000 years of Vorthak intellectual superiority collapsing into dust. But you're supposed to be primitive, he whispered, his voice carrying all the desperate hope of someone clinging to the last shred of their worldview. You only just discovered space travel. You haven't even figured out proper gravity manipulation. Your technology is practically Stone Age compared to ours. Jake nodded agreeably. Oh yeah, we're definitely behind the curve on the tech stuff. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? We got to space using what's basically controlled explosions and sheer bloody-mindedness. Most species probably developed nice, safe, sensible propulsion systems. We just made bigger explosions and sat on top of them. He gestured casually, as if discussing the weather rather than the most terrifying approach to space exploration anyone had ever conceived. I mean, our first guy in space was basically strapped to a missile and fired into orbit just to see what would happen. Could have exploded, could have cooked him alive, could have sent him spinning off into the void forever. But we figured, hey, only one way to find out, right? Professor Crix made a sound like a deflating balloon filled with nightmares. Anyway, Jake continued with the relentless cheerfulness of someone who had no idea he was systematically destroying the sanity of everyone around him. I should probably try to help Fluffy feel better. Poor guy seems really stressed. And with that, Jake did the one thing that Professor Crix's already frayed nerves absolutely could not handle. He reached toward the desk, where Fluffy was hiding. No, Professor Crix shrieked, lunging forward with the desperation of someone trying to prevent an intergalactic incident. Don't touch him! He could kill you! 12 hearts, regenerating limbs, venom that dissolves steel. Jake paused, his hand halfway to the desk, and gave the professor the kind of patient look you'd give a child who was afraid of a particularly friendly dog. Professor, he said gently, he's not going to hurt me. Look at him. They looked. From under the desk came the unmistakable sound of a 12-foot armored killing machine trying very hard to become smaller and less noticeable. It was like watching a tank try to hide behind a houseplant. Besides, Jake added with a shrug, even if he did try something, it's not like it would be the most dangerous thing I've dealt with this week. Last Tuesday I had to remove a redback spider from my shower, and Thursday I helped my neighbor relocate a brown snake that had gotten into his garden shed. He said this with the same tone you'd use to describe picking up groceries. Jake, Professor Crix said, and his voice now carried the kind of defeat usually reserved for generals surrendering after long, hopeless sieges. What exactly is a brown snake? Ah, just one of the most venomous snakes on Earth, Jake replied casually. One bite can kill you in about 30 minutes, but they're actually pretty chill if you don't startle them. Just had to use a broom handle and a bucket. Basic Tuesday, really. That was the moment when Professor Crix's last remaining student, a brave little Zephyrian named Pip who had somehow managed to stay conscious through the entire presentation, finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his three-chambered brain. Jake, Pip squeaked in a voice like a mouse trying to interview a hurricane. What kind of music do humans listen to for fun? Jake's face lit up like he'd been asked about his favorite hobby. Oh man, we've got all kinds, but personally I'm really into death metal. You know, really heavy stuff with lots of screaming and lyrics about violence and mortality and the meaninglessness of existence. Great for working out to. Pip made a sound like a deflating balloon and promptly fainted. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how the Galactic University Xenobiology 101 class ended up completely empty except for one cheerfully oblivious human exchange student, one traumatized professor having what could only be described as a species-wide identity crisis, and one 12-foot apex predator who had apparently decided that the safest place in the universe was under a desk, as far away from Jake Murphy as physically possible while still being in the same room. The beautiful irony was that Fluffy, despite being designed by millions of years of evolution to be a perfect killing machine, had somehow become Jake's biggest fan. Not in the way that fans usually work, mind you, but in the way that small prey animals become fans of things that could eat them, but choose not to. Every day after that, Fluffy would wait under that desk until Jake arrived, and then spend the entire class period making what could only be described as respectful whimpering sounds in his direction. Professor Crix, meanwhile, submitted a formal request to be transferred to a different department. When asked what he wanted to teach instead, he said he'd be happy with anything safer than xenobiology. They offered him advanced black hole physics, quantum paradox theory, or introduction to temporal mechanics. He took all three. And Jake? Well, Jake got an A+ in the class, and a personal recommendation letter from Professor Crix that simply read, "Please keep this human happy, for all our sakes." But the real kicker came at the end of the semester, when Jake casually mentioned to his new alien friends that he was thinking about going into interstellar wildlife management after graduation. He thought it might be fun to help preserve endangered species across the galaxy. Fluffy is still in therapy,